Welcome again to Dr. Jeremy England, former professor of physics at MIT, author of Every Life is on Fire, currently a machine learning researcher in the biotech industry here in Israel.
And thanks to everyone for joining. So today, I thought it would be interesting to discuss the intersection of a few different topics that may not at first seem obviously related, but I think they should be understood to be related, and it gives us a chance to ask a few different challenging questions at the outset where maybe we can start to see where they intersect by the end. And some of this comes from our current historical moment and things that we have kind of from the popular science segment of popular culture. But some of these other things are more general questions that we could ask, but maybe are still particularly pertinent in this time and in this era. So I am not sure that I have a particular order for the questions, so I'll just lay out a few of them and we can strike up from there. So the first kind of question sounds sort of maybe the silliest, but it's becoming a less silly one and a more substantive one, both because of real advances in technology and also because some people are making serious statements that are ultimately also silly. You'll see what I mean. So when I was growing up in the United States, let's say 30 years ago, and really since long before that, we had the concept in science fiction of the idea that maybe one day people will make robots that are so intelligent and so powerful that they will be overthrown by their own creations and will end up either being wiped out by them or put into servitude by them. And really, you have this going all the way back to, Asimov and things like that, and possibly before. Perhaps it's a very old idea, in fact. But in the version of it that was in circulation, I remember when I was a kid, you had movies like The Terminator, some fantasy, a negative fantasy of the idea of robots created by people who decide to make war against humankind and are super intelligent and super powerful, and so they're very successful in doing that. And it's a scary idea, but at the time it was sort of light fantasy in some sense. And now in the era that we're currently living in, there obviously have been huge advances in computer technology and things that used to just seem like an interesting idea to muse about the potential of technology start to seem more concrete to people, where there are many things people now can do using computer algorithms that used to seem like they were not in the province of technology, but really in the unassailable province of what human minds are good at. Things like recognizing properties of complex images and whether certain things are happening in them or present in them and certain things aren't, or predicting things that require seemingly a lot of synthesis of conceptual understanding, translating languages from translating words from one language to another. And there's been leaps and bounds in how successful computers have been at doing a lot of things. And so people are getting more and more impressed with what you can do by basing forms of artificial intelligence on machine learning. And this is just very much out in the popular culture. And at the same time, also, you have, I don't know, a species of type of futurist or false prophet or whatever you want to call them, people who write popular books for broad consumption, who make these kind of speculations about the impending overthrow of humankind by their algorithms. And there are people who are trying to make that point less and less fictionally and with greater and greater seriousness, and are being taken more seriously in the let's say broader public of the cosmopolitan and hyper technological world that surrounds us. So one kind of question that you could ask is that, if this is not just a story for a fantasy world, to entertain you when you go to the movies, but if instead it's starting to become a substantive and serious question of where will the boundaries or the sort of firewalls, or let's say fences be defined for how much we let technology that is making decisions on an algorithmic basis, where are the boundaries for how that encroaches on our lives? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Could it be both? Do we have to worry about the bad scenarios and avoid them somehow, but we should be trying to benefit from the good? And this is a broad question and a practical set of questions. I'm only interested for the purposes of this year. Obviously there's tremendous potential for technology to do the right thing with it if you have the right kind of goals and discipline about how you apply it. But I'm not even going to get into the detail of this, other than to pose a question for this talk in terms of how it has to do with Torah, which is how should someone looking at all of these technological developments from the perspective of the Hebrew prophets, right? From the perspective of our sages, from the perspective of our tradition, how should someone, through the lens of Torah, view the development of these kinds of technologies, of what we call artificial intelligence of various kinds? And should it be something that we think the Torah, in a sense, can't speak of, because obviously this wasn't a concern when people were building things out of rocks and chunks of wood, and only since the development of computer technology could this ever be a real concern? And so it has no relevance or currency in the world and in the language of Moshe Rabbeinu or Yeshayahu Navi or whomever? Or on the flip side, is there something in what Tanakh especially understands about the human condition that is so universal and so panoramic across space and across time, that there are things that we've already been taught by our tradition that, without even our necessarily realizing it, really do pertain to this moment and will help us to make sense of whether there is some position that an Oved Hashem should be trying to adopt in response to these developments. And so that's one kind of question, right? So summarizing it, what is the perspective of the Oved Hashem, according to the Torah, on technologies that start to, in a sense, simulate human intelligence and that maybe worry us they will one day exceed human intelligence? If you are following the arc of science fiction to futurism that surrounds us these days. So that's one kind of question. A different kind of question that you could pose, I think, at any point in human history from the standpoint, again, of Torah, but I think it's an important one, especially in this era, which is an era dominated by scientific thinking, is, do we think that there's anything about idolatry that quote unquote works or worked? And that obviously is a very strange question to be posing, and you have to put it in quotes when talking about this from the standpoint of Torah, because obviously the zeroth order, or like the first answer from Torah, is, of course idolatry doesn't work. It's, you're worshiping false gods. Of course it's leading you down a crooked path. It's exactly what we're being taught not to do, or how not to do it, and all these things. And it's a life of study trying to develop the capacity to avoid that kind of behavior. And that is the first thing that must be said. But on the other hand, I think sometimes we're so steeped in that basic lesson that we might have a tendency to dismiss out of hand the temptation of idolatry, because we accept willingly the idea that it doesn't work, but we maybe are too simplistic in how we understand what it means to say that it doesn't work. That it's easy to kind of deride someone engaging in that kind of an activity and say, it's a children's story in a sense. It's like a child taking their action figure and imagining it really does have superpowers and wanting those superpowers to save them. Whereas if you looked at someone who, in a really difficult situation was asking their rubber action hero figurine to use his magical powers to save them, that would seem very childish and very naive, and like it's not going to work. And there are passages in our tradition that do, in a sense, deride the practice in those terms. There's a famous one in Perek Mem Dalet of Yeshayahu Navi, where he is talking about describing the praxis of a worshiper of idols and saying, look, he cuts down a tree, he takes the wood. With half the wood, he makes a fire to roast his meal, and the other half he cuts it into a shape and bows down to it and says, "Save me, save me." And there is something kind of ludicrous and about what's being portrayed, and it's meant to be almost sort of comical, and it's a derisive frame that Yeshayahu was putting on the practice, at least on the surface. But of course, if we look at the history of Am Yisrael that's described in Tanakh, there must be something more complicated about this story, because the slippery slope to further idolatry, or the temptation to engage in idolatry, is so powerful that even in the generation of the people who were liberated from Mitzrayim and brought by Moshe through the splitting sea and all of that, they're turning around and making a golden calf. And I don't think that we're meant to look at that and say, oh, they made a wrong turn, and they should have turned left, and they turned right instead, and they were so stupid. And one has a tendency to feel this way, like, how could it go wrong so quickly? But of course, the answer has to be, it went wrong so quickly because it's very, very difficult always for people to avoid the essence of what is a problem with idolatry. So maybe it's easy not to believe that your child's superhero figurine has magic powers, right? And maybe that was something that was harder to avoid in the ancient world, in the time of pagans, where you had whole civilizations that had raised people from birth to believe in the magic power of actual figurines. But the thing that is a problem with that practice, the idea of substituting a too simple idea, or substituting a human construction of some kind for the oneness of Hashem and the completeness of Hashem's oneness, the totality of it, his transcendent supremacy over everything, right? That he isn't just a simple idea that you can sort of write down in a few lines, so to speak, or that you can summarize in a simple shape. That temptation is always with us. And that's, I think, that has to be part of the reason that when we look at Bnei Yisrael turning to the golden calf, Egel HaZahav, or when we look at Shlomo Melech, who built Beit HaMikdash and who is the wisest of the wise in his own lifetime, turning to idolatry and even sacrificing to Moloch. I mean, these things just, they're so gut-wrenching, because you feel like, how on earth could this person that on the one hand, we would be so tempted to say he has the ideal relationship with the world and with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He's the builder of the temple, and he prays for wisdom so that he may judge wisely, and all of these things, that these attributes we hope to have. And then it's suddenly he's off the rails and doing absolutely the wrong thing by the end of the story. When we see those things happening, we're being told this is always there, no matter who you are. You could be the greatest tzaddik, you could be the greatest, let's say, understander of the message of Hashem who ever lived, and still you can't just eliminate or remove that temptation. And I think usually we focus still on the temptation part as though it's kind of like a hunger we have that has no explanation, like that people have urges to things that sometimes are forbidden to them. Like we may feel that we're tempted to eat something that is not permitted to us according to the Torah, or obviously sexual temptation is something that in Tanakh and in the daily life of people experience and struggle with, obviously, when they're trying to live their life according to a set of rules given by God. But when we look at something like Avodah Zarah, or idolatry, I think it's not as easy for us to appreciate in a visceral sense where that temptation is coming from. Like, why does someone want to do that? When are they doing it? And what is the direction that the slippery slope points in, so to speak, because it's not like a hunger in your stomach. It's something more abstract than that, clearly, but it's still somehow always is a draw. So if people are tempted to do it, what are they hoping to get out of doing it? And why do they keep making the mistake of thinking that it works? And I think that that is a subject that we need to engage with in this discussion a little bit. And I think it's actually related to the robots and AI kind of question as well. But it's coming from a different direction. It's sort of the question of what is it in, as understood by Tanakh, the practice of idolatry that actually you could say, okay, I get why someone's doing this. It looks to be working for him, sort of in the short term. Like in the long term, it's a crooked path and all of that. But in the short term, I get what's working about it. And it's worth analyzing that a little bit, particularly because I think that there's kind of a veil thrown over that understanding in the present era for reasons that we can explain a little bit. And maybe this isn't a third question entirely, but it's sort of a way of synthesizing the other ideas. I guess the question is there anything in the temptation presented by the worship of idols that was somehow easier for pagans and is more difficult for people in the present era, which is actually perhaps a potential ingredient of a correct relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, meaning that people, I think, in the present have a tendency, particularly in very Western influenced societies, to see the present era as the pinnacle of the development of human knowledge and civilization understanding. And obviously there are good reasons for that. But the question is whether in reaching one kind of pinnacle, you sort of lose your ability to easily feel or experience other things that might have been easier to experience for ancient pagans, that in the hands of ancient pagans were applied incorrectly, so to speak, and they led to things that were meant to be rejected according to our tradition, but that they still were sort of a substance or a phenomenon that had a positive application, and you don't necessarily want to just eliminate it from the human psyche because that has other dangers or pitfalls. So those are the different kinds of ideas I wanted to put on the table at the outset. And I think taking things in order, probably the most important thing is just to talk briefly about an actual source to get us thinking a little bit about what kinds of things idolatry might be for people and how it came to be this ubiquitous human practice, and why people would do it so much if it quote unquote doesn't work at all, or if there's no point to it. So let's start by just talking a little bit about the golden calf, which is the archetypal study of idolatry, and maybe refer to a few other sources in connection with that, and then we can return to the more panoramic view of some of these different issues and try to see how they fit together a little bit. So in brief, we're talking about the plot of Egel HaZahav, the golden calf. What is it that happens when we have Bnei Yisrael leaving Mitzrayim and making a golden calf? I think for brevity, I'm not going to read through the whole passage in Parashat Ki Tisa where you get this, but people are, I think, usually familiar with the main details, and I'll just want to emphasize a few. So Moshe has gone up the mountain. He's been gone for a long time. The people don't know where he is, so they go to Aharon and they say, we don't know where this Moshe who brought us out of Mitzrayim is anymore. And then they say, therefore, now get up, kum, ve'aseh lanu Elohim asher yelchu lefanenu. You should make for us, and it's asher yelchu, so that's a plural. So even though the word being used could also be an epithet used for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in this case, because it's Elohim asher yelchu lefanenu, it's make us gods that will go before us in the plural, because it's not yelech. But so it's already kind of showing the problem with their kavanah, with their intention, that they're already headed towards a kind of polytheistic and therefore idolatrous outcome. But there is a moment, so we'll skip over what happens in the middle, and then we'll go back to it. Aaron makes them a molten calf of gold, and then once it is created, they say again, "This is the God, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." And again, they say, "Eile Elohecha." These are your gods, really. It's not "this is your God," because they say "Eile," not "Ze." It's again in the plural. So all the way through, we're being told that there's kind of a polytheism to what they're doing. But I think one of the things that's interesting about that is that it points to, let's say, the potential for more than one power to be referenced by what's being created. Like, we usually think of it as it's a golden calf. Like there was one God that they mistook for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it was this calf-shaped deity that they somehow tripped over and sort of made the mistake of thinking that it was this God instead of Hashem, who brought them out of Egypt. But you really have to give Bnei Israel more credit. Like, these are people who lived through Yetziat Mitzrayim. What is the mistake that they're making? Like, how could they go so far off the rails so quickly? And I think that to do that, picking up on this plural thing, you could say, maybe there's actually an analysis we're meant to do of Egel HaZahav, like the golden calf, where we can understand multiple facets of it that help us to understand different elements that are firing their desire to describe their relationship to some deity in a way that comes out improper. Like, that it's not one thing. It's not that they just really like baby cows, right? There's something more multifaceted to this. And we're being encouraged to see that by this pluralization that we see in the grammar. And so I think that now you can say, well, what are the different things you can get out of this Masecha, this molten image that was created by Aaron Kohen? And I think in rapid fire, just to lay out a few different things that I want to point to for the purpose of this discussion. I think it's more than one thing. It's not purely just about Egel as an animal. I think it's also about the root that means round, like agol, like igul in modern Hebrew is a circle. And I don't think that's just sort of a coincidental resemblance. The original calf is made from what? It's made from rings, golden rings in the ears of all the people. That's what Aaron tells them to collect. He said, go around and collect all the golden rings in everyone's ears, and we'll make something out of it. So we already have the idea of a circle from these nizamim, these rings out of which it's composed. And also, igul is not just a word in modern Hebrew. The word agol means round in various places in Tanakh. For example, the word agala means a carriage. In the moment, for example, where Yosef is exchanging messages with Yaakov after they were being reunited, and there's this sending of carriages from Mitzrayim to Eretz Canaan. So agalot are the things that are being sent. And Chazal even have a way of hinting that this is related, because what they say is, well, that was actually a secret message for Yaakov, because he would remember that the day before Yosef went missing, they had been studying the mitzvah of Egla Rufa, which is this weird mitzvah involving a calf. And so Chazal are saying, when you see this word Agala, which is really about the round circular wheels of these carriages, also think about calves for some reason. So there we have a very authentic source for this connection. And we'll talk a little bit more in a second about Egla Rufa, because I think it's also a source that has some comment to make about this discussion. So, but the point is, for now, let's say this is not just about calves, it's also about round circles, and it's not also just made of an arbitrary material, it's made of gold. So we're not just thinking about calves and whatever it is that we like about that animal, it's also a particular material that has particular properties. Now, granted, you could say gold is a natural one to think of when you're making an idol, because gold is very popular. It's the sort of most precious metal in the concept of the ancient world. But you still have different things that are made out of different materials. And the choice of gold in particular, I think you have to ask what that means as well, that there's something about it that's very at the highest level, like, and maybe it's about wealth, and it's about the intensification of wealth, or the accumulation of wealth. And so, and lastly, I think we have to focus again on this whole idea of what triggered the people to be talking about this new God that they're creating, and what their motivation is. There's this repetition of the idea of who was it who brought us out of Mitzrayim, right? It's not just, let's pick a deity to worship because we don't have anything to do and we want to give meaning to our lives. They're specifically interested in this question of who and what brought us out of Mitzrayim. They say at first it was this man Moshe who brought us out of Mitzrayim, and he's missing now, so we need some other God to go before us, because like they're thinking in terms of whom are we following, and that's what brought us out of Mitzrayim. And then once the God, this Masecha, this false deity, is created, then again they're in this repetition of these are the gods, or this is the God, however you want to say it, who brought you out of Egypt, out of Mitzrayim. And I think that you can think of this partly as about the idea of a post hoc explanation. Like, a set of events has occurred, and while it was happening, the sea splitting and everything, these people were filled with awe. But when the afterglow fades, they're saying, what is this world we live in? How does it work? What is it about? What are the powers that are actually consistent from one day to the next that tell us how to get along in the world? Because people do relax back to that question, since that's actually what concerns them on a daily basis, right? They want to, and then this gets back to this question of what is the temptation of idolatry? The temptation of idolatry always was the temptation to serve gods that would do for you, right? That you want to use the practice of idolatry to create a system for yourself that cultivates behaviors that make you successful. And I think this is the thing that I was alluding to. It's very hard to appreciate in the present day, because I think there's been this millennia long period of idol smashing of a certain sort that was, especially led by Islam and Christianity, that each in their way were very successful at eliminating certain aspects of idolatrous practice without eliminating others. And we don't have to get deeply into that right now, but I think that the operative point is that there are some things that, if you look at the emergence of the modern era in the West, which is this sort of synthesis of some ideas from Tanakh and Judaic ideas, and then many, let's say, Hellenic ideas, and how they fuse to produce Christian ideas, and it all sort of swirls together. But one of the things that comes out of this that I think people very often try, when looking at the development of Western ideas, to attribute in a complementary way to biblical thinking, is that they say the idea that there was one God, which comes from Abraham and comes from the Bible originally, and all of that, that changed people's view of the world from a pagan one where there were all these different personalities, all these different powers. There was a river god, and there was a tree god, and there was this and there was that, and you had to sort of separately make your deals with each one of them. That it caused people to view the world instead as this whole system governed by the laws set by one lawmaker. And then that helped them to appreciate that maybe all of nature could be explainable as the result of a much smaller set of laws. And so maybe that helped to give rise to modern science. People have made that argument. And I don't think we have to either believe or disbelieve that argument to at least acknowledge that part of what that means is that scientists in the present day, culturally speaking, are very proud idol smashers of a certain kind. They're the ones who will come to you and say, look, this thing you're doing with your superhero action figurine, where you're asking for it to save you when you're trapped in an elevator that's dangling by a cable that's about to break or something like that, that won't work, because that kind of magic is in fact a fantasy that is not really going to be capable of saving you. And here's how science can show you that that's true. And so we live under this blanket of scientific idol smashing that's very successful, because when science directs itself at smashing that kind of idolatry, it is on the money, right? That kind of idolatry, and that aspect of idolatry is very easy to disprove, and very easy to show that it doesn't work. from the standpoint of science. However, that isn't the only way of having a sort of a set of idolatrous attitudes. And I also think that it goes very far, or maybe too far, in trying to fully sort of scour our intellect of any capacity at the same time for encountering personality in the world. So what do I mean by those two statements? Well, first of all, if you look at ancient pagans, I think probably a scientist who laughs at ancient pagans now doesn't give them enough credit, because what they would say is these people were fools. Basically, the entirety of humanity were a bunch of children who grew up all telling each other about their magic action figures, and they were all remaining childlike in their misunderstanding of how the world works and believing in a bunch of stuff that doesn't work. And it was a very long time coming to eventually eliminate all of that confusion and falsehood from people's understanding of the world. That's the sort of Western Enlightenment scientific view of the progression of human ideas. And that may be true to some extent, but what I think that obviously also leads to in this Western Enlightenment view is that you laugh at anyone who finds any capacity for encounter with a personality in the events of the world, right? Because it's not just about talking to the river god and to the tree god. The same kind of argument will also say that having an experience of encounter with the will of a personality by seeing in the events of the world and in your life the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that also is supposed to be provably nonsense according to that Western Enlightenment and scientific view. But I think that that isn't giving, as I said, enough credit to the original success of idolatrous practices in their own time. If you go back to ancient paganisms and these ideologies that were competing with Torah thousands of years ago in the ancient Mediterranean. Now, why would I say that? First of all, because the worship of idols was always about partly codification of practices of various kinds, right? So it's about getting people to do things together by giving them a symbolic framework that reminds them of a set of reasons for why they're doing all these different things together, where you have your holidays and you have your rituals that you perform on these different days. And sometimes there are things that seem to have no direct material consequence, because it's something like you light something on fire and it burns up and the smoke blows everywhere. And why would that have any impact on anything, seemingly? And other times it might also be that you're doing things that, if you really think about it, you have caused people to gather in certain places, or you've caused certain kinds of economic events to take place. As we see in Torah, for example, the worship of Hashem involves a lot of agricultural redistribution and also just bringing fruits to the temple and needing a steady supply of livestock of certain kinds and having to have craftsmen who can do, perform certain kinds of crafts. So really, there are a lot of material, economic, and political consequences to the establishment of a successful religious cult, whether it be the kind of thing that we do in Torah, that we're commanded to do, or whether it be something that an ancient pagan might have been doing. And I think it goes too far to say that there must have really just been absolutely nothing in Greek worship of this or that Greek deity, or Sumerian worship of this or that Sumerian deity. There was nothing that it was doing that was causing anything at all to happen in the world that could have justified a person for trying to cause the spread of that form of idolatry. I think the reason that ancient kings were pushing certain idols on their people, or the reason that certain idols really took hold and spread, was clearly because they often were connected with things that impacted agriculture, that impacted politics. Like, you could get people to go to war because of the symbolic system that a certain idolatry created. You could get people to stop killing each other and have peace together in their society because of a symbolic system that people would latch onto and agree to. And so the idea of a picture that you worship that has particular components, where it's, this deity is half this animal and half that animal, and is holding this kind of a weapon in this hand and is holding that kind of a plant in this other hand, it all seems very arbitrary to us now. But for someone who is trying to spread a set of ideas that could transform human collective behavior in ways that might really be the difference between a society in the short term thriving or failing, you have to think of it as technology that could have actually been quite effective, right? And assume to some degree, just by virtue of the competition of different things, that the ones that really stuck around for a while were probably a lot more effective than other ones that they, overwhelmed and defeated. So I think we have to give that much credit to what idols were doing. On the one hand, so that we can appreciate why the temptation was always there and why the temptation is still there in the present day. Because the first point that we have to draw out of this is that even if you are the kind of person who wouldn't, ask an action figure to save you, so to speak, because you believe it has unlimited magic powers, you might still be very tempted to engage in activities that are effectively idolatrous because you believe there's, so to speak, no other way technologically to achieve something that you want to achieve. That you've proven yourself that it is impossible to do something unless you perform certain actions. And then the question is where the slippery slope is, where some of the actions that you're performing might start to border on actually being sort of worshipful or being really more like sacrifices than like the use of a tool. And like, where is the boundary between those kinds of activities? So that, I think, is an especially important point today, because there definitely are things that you can point to in the practice of people who are very science-minded in principle and would never do something that in their mind they think of as riceable, that like actually making the shape of a star or a human being graven in stone and bowing down to it and hoping that that would help them, but where their view of what the world is and how it works does make them feel quite enslaved to forces and rules and requirements that are summarized by human constructions, maybe much more elaborate human constructions than the idols of old, or at least very abstract ones that are expressed in different kinds of pictures or in different kinds of symbols. But still, that's a thing that people might still be tempted to do today if they say, there's no other way for us to control the weather this way, or there's no other way for us to have enough food by X date, or all the other kinds of calamities people are always trying to avert. The desperation that people always are willing to have, the need to produce collective action, and the willingness that brings about in leaders to create simple symbolic systems that will generate the right collective action in the masses. Those things are always present and always there. And the fact that, let's say in the Western world, there's much less actual prostration before carved stone images doesn't necessarily mean that people are not capable of essentially worshiping false gods in their actions and in their words. And so that's like one path that we could go down further and try to analyze. But I think particularly the study of Egel HaZahav, to me, really makes that point about the present day, because if you think about Egel HaZahav and what we were just locating in it, what is it connected with? It's connected with wealth, and it's connected with wheels, and it's connected with circles. So all at once, you're evoking a few different ideas. First of all, the idea of technology, like the wheel. What is the one piece of technology that's maybe the most important in the transformation of human civilization? You could maybe argue different things. Some people would say fire is, but maybe fire is not really technology, right? But I think the wheel would be certainly a sort of top 5 list that people would come up with, right? And then it's not just the wheel per se, it's also circles. It's the idea of mathematics, the idea of mathematical order in the universe that there's there to understand with wisdom and to exploit. And this even is captured, there's a use of the same root for round in Sefer Melachim, describing the temple that Shlomo HaMelech created, the great and wise Shlomo HaMelech, where it gives the diameter and circumference of this round pool. And I think it quotes a ratio of 3 to 1 there, so it's sort of working with not very many significant figures, but it's showing you that this word, this root for Egel, is even connected with this idea of mathematical order and roundness as a talisman for, let's say, Pythagorean mysticism and the idolatry that lies there, as opposed to just being round like an egg. And lastly, this idea of wealth, or not lastly, but the idea of wealth, I think it's so easy in the present era to appreciate that, of course, if you have lots of wisdom about mathematics and technology, that you can produce a lot more wealth, and that gold goes naturally along with it, and that you can have a much richer and wealthier and comfortable existence. And this idea of comfort, I think, is if you derive it from the idea of wealth and technology, it's so interesting that when we're talking about an egel, what is an egel? Well, Chazal specifically connected again this idea of the agala, the wheel, with the calf, the egla, in this mitzvah of egla ufa. And isn't it interesting that when the mitzvah of the egla ufa is described in a completely different part of the Torah, where we have this calf that's going to be thrown into a nachal etan, a sort of raging stream at the bottom of a canyon, that it's specifically an eglat bakar asher lo obad ba. So it's not just a heifer or it's not just a female calf, but it's one that has never been used to work. It is at once both evoking the idea of never having had to really work, because you're kind of comfortable, but also in the notion of a cow, what it reminds you of is that cows are work animals, and work animals are a way of making human life more comfortable, because you make the animal work and the person doesn't have to work as much. So you even have the idea of comfort, and comfort coming from animal labor, being evoked as well by the Egel Zahav. So if I put all these things together, let's say wisdom about nature, mathematics, that kind of thing with the circle, and also the wheel, the agala, the carriage, the technology, is also captured in the idea of the Egel. Also this idea of wealth from gold, and also this idea of comfort, of not having had to work, and maybe not having to work because you can get animals to work. What's so interesting about that is that brings us back to this question of, well, what brought us out of Mitzrayim? And this starts to be a secular philosophical discourse on what brought us out of Mitzrayim, because what Bnei Israel are meant to remember, and what we are always meant to remember, is that it is HaKadosh Baruch Hu who brought us out of Mitzrayim, that he is the reason that we were liberated from Paro, and not anything else, or at least not any other way of describing that process that doesn't admit that Hashem is there orchestrating whatever elements or events it was that allowed us to leave Mitzrayim. But if you ask, let's say, futurist false prophets of the present era, where human liberation from slavery comes from, they will very often say things like, well, we started getting a lot of wisdom and rationality, and that led to science that gave us technology, and also, let's say, substitutes for human labor that results from technology that might initially have involved, animals pulling carts, but you can get even better than that. That produces a lot of wealth, and then bingo, we don't have to have mass enslavement anymore. And so it's a whole discourse on how you can mechanistically, in a way that excludes HaKadosh Baruch Hu from view, you can explain the liberation of humankind from slavery, supposedly, in all of these very material and wisdom and rationality based or scientific and secular terms. And that's what they're looking for. They're saying, what brought us out of Mitzrayim? If it wasn't Moshe, we need to have a framework for understanding what got us here. And when they, in the absence of Moshe and in the absence of that link to Hashem, they try to come up with something, what they come up with is an explanation that sounds very rationalistically plausible, but is still problematic and leads to idolatry, because what it ultimately is doing is it's excluding Hashem's hand from the picture. It's saying, we did this ourselves, or wisdom did this, and maybe we should worship wisdom, or the seeking of wealth, the free market did this, and so maybe we should just try to seek wealth, et cetera, all the different versions of things that you could do to replace the oneness of Hashem with a simpler idea. Like maybe we just need for people to seek wealth in a self-interested way, and the market will lift all the boats. Or maybe we need for everyone to just be wise enough and to study math and science and produce technology, and then we'll be so rich that we won't have to work anymore because robots will work for us. And we'll get back to more with robots in a second. So I think that if there's one idea that we wanted to make sure to get through tonight, because this is really based on analysis of a source, I think it would be that we live in an era where there is a lot of very successful idol smashing of a certain kind that inures one to the point of feeling like that dragon has been slayed, and we don't any longer feel tempted to believe in the magic of little carved figures of animals or people to save us. And so there must be just other bigger and better things to do. And what that does is it's like we don't have an immune system for the still extremely tempting forms of idolatry that rage on in the present day, that maybe come more in the form of worship of technology, worship of wealth, worship of scientific wisdom, or other favorites, love, peace, liberty, all these things that sound really great, but they turn into the worship of a false god if you say it's a totalizing ideal and I'm going to substitute my construction of its symbolic framework for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and I'll serve that instead of serving him. But I do think it is good to try to now come back a little bit to this question at the beginning that seems unrelated, which is, what are we supposed to do with this idea that maybe our technology could become more powerful than us? And how does the Torah teach us to deal with that on the one hand? And on the other hand, also, is there anything in what pagans knew how to do well with their idols, like, so to speak, their action figure idols, that maybe has been too hastily discarded and stamped out by the Western Enlightenment, and it makes it hard for people in very modern societies to relate to, but which actually might be part of something that we should be trying to seek in our relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if it's channeled in the right way. And so I'll try to answer, or not answer, but offer a thought about the second question first, and then we can circle back, to finish with robots in the end, because it's the most ridiculous part of what I'm saying. So I think that, as I was saying before, one of the things that you can say idolatry of ancient pagans perhaps was doing that really did work in a sense as technology, was that it was a way of organizing people, that you create a symbolic structure that everyone grabs onto, and then you can get them to do things that no one can do by himself. And that is real power. That is still a thing that works in the present day. We do it with money, and we do it with contracts, and we do it with various kinds of symbolic structures that have hugely powerful organizing effects on large numbers of people, and generate a lot of wealth, and put a lot of power in the hands of a few people in some cases. So there's that aspect to it. But then there is also the aspect of what an ancient pagan understood about the world that now is often taught as the thing that even, let's say biblical ideas helped to discard from the human way of thinking in a way that might have led to science in a good way, is to be able to relate to experience as though it's a personality and not some kind of mathematical mechanism, right? That I always think about this, because when the Zkenim, the elders, and Moshe, they go and have this sort of otherworldly experience of encounter with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, like ascending to Shamayim, so to speak, and they see under his feet Livnat HaSapir, like the brickwork of sapphire, and that's described in Parshat Mishpatim at this encounter sort of connected with the revelation at Sinai. I think what's so wonderful about the word sapir, which is the stone, sapphire, is that it both evokes the idea of counting, because lispo is to count, and also at the same time, there's the idea of a sipor, which is a story, like that you can tell someone something with the verb, or with the root of samech pei resh, or you can count things. And what it's kind of telling you is that if you're going to talk about what the universe is built out of, what it's really made of, you can't separate that. There's something maybe fundamentally mathematical about it, and that maybe points towards things that scientists do. But there's also something that's about stories and telling stories about what the world is and how it works. And maybe you can't get by without, making reference to that. And I think that the story aspect of it is the one that we maybe have more trouble relating to in a modern society, whereas an ancient pagan would have just said, oh yeah, I have all these elaborate myths that I tell about this tree here and my river god, and that helps remind me to do this and not to do that. And when all of us tell this story to each other, it actually acts as an organizing principle for our whole society, and we get things out of that. And to the degree that that's true, and that even where people, we're capable of reacting to their environment as though the character in that story was capable of having dialogue with them, it might have been that they were ultimately led down a false path by the fact that they were engaging in an overly simple idolatry. But their capacity to locate and experience a personality that's sort of looking through to them from the other side, and maybe has a message for them, that isn't something that we're meant to burn out of ourselves and never have in our hearts, right? But I think that anyone raised and educated in a modern society, they're constantly being taught the emptiness and the foolishness and the stupidity of that stance, that perspective on experience in the world. And that as a result, I think creates a large number of people, even who might be very observant Jews, where they feel it's not allowed to them, if they're like a smart and rational person, they're not allowed to relate to experience as though Hashem is really there to speak to them or there to show them things. But it's more like, I'll keep the rules and the rules are good and I have those from Hashem and that's how I relate. But there are problems, I think, with, it's sort of keeping your heart in deep freeze in that way can limit the kind of religious experiences that's possible. And I think there can be a very full and kasher and permitted and even, required religious experience for Am Yisrael that has to retain that capacity to relate to Hashem in the world and to use our capacity to see a personality in the events of our lives and the events of the history of our people, and to see his hand and all of these things that have been forbidden to us by the selective idol smashing, let's say, of the Western Enlightenment. So that, I think, that's not saying we should all be pagans, or it's not saying that ancient pagans were correct, chas v'chalila, but it is saying that just the same way there are things that in the present day are easier for us to avoid about idolatry because of the supremacy of the Western Enlightenment in the modern world, there may also be things that are harder for us to accomplish in Avodat Hashem as a result of the, let's say, incompleteness of the Western Enlightenment. Because the Western Enlightenment in its own way, if you take it as a totalizing ideal, it's just another way of worshiping false gods. So with that, I'll close up the sort of second question. And then lastly, we just have to sort of touch on the robots briefly, and then we can have a little bit of a discussion. So I think that I hope I'll just be making a very brief and comforting statement about this, which is that I think sometimes we look at the present era and we look at ourselves in the world now, and we say there are all these things about the world today that are so different from what the world was in the generation where the Torah was given, that there must be things we have to deal with that were just not dreamt of or not spoken about. And we don't have guidance about how to handle them. So it's sort of, okay, there was good advice for how to deal with Nevi'ei Baal, like the prophets of Baal thousands of years ago in Tanakh. But now that we're talking about rise of the machines, where the robots are getting smarter and smarter, and what if they decide to make war on humanity, that sort of science fiction type thing, which there are honestly people today in the Western world who are taken half seriously, who talk in those terms, and it's kind of ridiculous. But the question is, are they just to be dismissed without thinking about it, or is there a serious answer to give for why what they're saying is a kind of foolishness? And I think that it's really the latter. And the point I would just make is very simple. What are robots? What are algorithms? What are computer programs? in the terminology of Tanakh and the terminology of Moshe and Hakadosh Baruch Hu and our sages and all of the Hebrew prophets, we would call this Maaseh Yedei Adam. They're things made by people, right? Some of them might even be shaped like people. You can actually make a robot that appears to have arms and legs, right? And then you would say, okay, what is this? It is the form of a man in molten metal. And yes, it's true that when people made the form of a man in molten metal thousands of years ago, it was a much less symbolically complex human creation, right? It was only as complicated as whatever you could sort of put in its hands and get people to remember to lay at its feet and all the different things that you wrapped that symbolic structure in. And now, of course, today, if you make a very powerful computer inside a human-shaped or not human-shaped thing, it could be just a box, right? That has a very complex symbolic structure to it that's created by people. There's something very intimidating about it because it has power, right? It can do things in some cases that people have a very difficult time doing by themselves. It's very hard for a person to count to 1 trillion in 1 second, and a computer can do that. It's also very hard for people to predict the weather a certain number of days in advance by looking at imagery of clouds over large parts of the Western Hemisphere or something, but maybe you can make a computer that can be better and better at doing that, right? So you can get better and better at using these things to predict, and they do have real power. But I think now that we've reminded ourselves that old idols, ancient pagan idols, they also had real power, right? They could get thousands of people to cooperate and build a tower or make war on another nation or do agriculture according to a shared set of rules that would be very productive if they worked together, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Old idols were terrifyingly powerful. And that's why ancient kings used them, because they found that using idols and spreading their popularity through the people or what have you would become an organizing principle that would put the strength of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people in their hands to deploy as they wished. And now, when we look at a computer and we say, wow, this computer is so much more powerful than any one individual, it's not different in that sense. It is a human construction that is tremendously powerful in ways that are very frightening and impressive, and that even might cause you to want to start to say, maybe I should just be asking this thing what to do, right? Maybe I should let it make the decisions and I'll just follow. And I'll move into a sort of posture of service, which is obviously not the same thing as sort of sacrificing a bull in front of it, at least initially. And who knows what people might be doing with their computers 100 years from now, but it is, at least right now, not something that people are mostly doing. But what is true is that people are getting more and more tempted to just say, well, maybe we should just ask the computer what to do because we don't know. And maybe, we're at the inflection point where that's going to happen more and more. The point very simply is, it's the same choice we have always had to make. If you want, you can be very impressed by the power, the real, natural, explainable power of idols in the world to do certain things, but choosing to serve them rather than to say, this is not an idol, this is a tool in my hand and I'll use it for a certain purpose, but it's my kli and I'll serve Hashem with my choices of what I do with my body and my words and the tools that I use, right? The choice between those options is always before us. And we have a very clear instruction from our tradition of how to handle that. So it's a very different thing to realize when you're facing this question in the present day. But I think that this is the depth and amazing insight of our Nevi'im, our prophets, that they were talking in terms thousands of years ago that are spot on for helping us to cope with a seemingly totally novel situation today. Because in both cases, what it's really about is, this is a human creation that can organize great power in one place and put it in the hands of an individual, whether it be a king or the user of a computer algorithm. But we, as individuals and as a nation, and as the light to the nations to show them how to handle this, always have the choice to serve Hashem and to call in his name and encourage all of humanity to serve him. And not be pulled down false paths by the temptations of the power promised by human constructions.
Does anybody have any questions? One thought I was thinking about is to what degree the Avodah Zarah of today could be considered literal halachic Avodah Zarah as compared to metaphoric Avodah Zarah. Maybe you could expand a little bit more about, were you thinking of literal violations of the halachic sense of Avodah Zarah, or did you mean it in a, like, just a tad less than that, like very bad, but not literally halachically Avodah Zarah, but metaphorically Avodah Zarah?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question to ask, because clearly in halakha we do have requirements for classifying something in certain terms, meaning that there's the idea of something, and then there's when do we actually trigger certain things, like, oh, if someone who engages in this activity wrote a Sefer Torah, we would burn it, according to what we were taught by our sages, because they are an Oved Avodah Zarah, and a Jew who is an Oved Avodah Zarah, who writes a Sefer Torah, like he's an apikors, and you don't keep that in circulation, even if you wrote every letter correctly. So the stakes in that sense are very high, because you actually need to know when you're dealing with a situation where that would actually be an action you would perform, because you wouldn't obviously burn a Sefer Torah lightly. And I don't want to claim, speaking al regel achat, like, very briefly and off the cuff, that I can decide in every case which we should call it. But I also think that I at least, I've thought about this some before, and what I've noticed at least is that the Torah bothers to be explicit in describing different things, meaning there's the idea of setting other gods before Hashem, and then there's the idea of making a pesel tmuna, like, a graven image, and performing worship of it. And I don't think that those are entirely the same thing, at least conceptually. It seems to me in the Torah's understanding that they may be very closely linked, and it might be, and this gets beyond my knowledge of halakha, and really, like, you'd have to study, I think, Masechet Avodah Zarah a lot in order to be very good at making this judgment. It might be, for example, that some of the halachot that we have that are really very sharp and require a lot of us in terms of how we change our behavior, that have to do with Avodah Zarah, that they would care about things like, is there an actual stone pillar? Is there an actual image of a this or a that? And we see that in things like the halachot for wine, where there's the idea of yain nesech, which is the wine that the Oved Avodah Zarah specifically kept in order to make a libation to his sort of family idol in his backyard. And then there's just stam yinam, like their wine, like they have wine and they were going to drink it, and they didn't intend to use it for Avodah Zarah. And there is a stricture on how we deal with stam yinam, but it's not as strict as the wine that they actually regularly used for their Avodah Zarah. And so I think there's room for a lot of shades of gray there. But I think if we're talking about the language that we actually encounter in the Torah, there seems to be enough reason to use two different kinds of terminologies, that it's not just saying don't bow down to an actual physical idol, and if you're not doing that, then you're all set, there's no problem. There's also the idea of not setting other gods before Hashem, or calling in the names of other gods, things like that. And for example, if someone all the time just says everything that I'm doing is about liberty, or everything that I'm doing is for the sake of peace, or everything that I'm doing is for the sake of justice, or what have you, right? If you knew someone who refused to acknowledge that anything could be true or correct unless it meets some simple criterion that he puts forward, that's judged in terms of an abstract concept like liberty or justice or peace or love or what have you, then clearly that is, in a sense, call it, it's deification of an abstract idea. And that person is doing something that we're not supposed to be doing. But whether you treat them this way or that way, as far as all the rules involving Ovdei Kochavim that Chazal give us, I think that obviously is a much more elaborate discussion.
Another thing that I was thinking about in the ancient, regarding the ancient world, would you, and I apologize if I missed a distinction that you did make. Are you making a distinction between, let's say, kings were forces of the actual concentration of power, but let's say there was certain types of idolatry that didn't really show any type of power. So what were you, how were you referring to those type of things that didn't constitute a concentration of power, or did I miss something?
Well, so I think maybe what I was referring to there is that let's say you just look at a level playing field for the competition of different kinds of idolatry, and you sort of look at it as an ecologist or a social physicist or whatever you want to call it, and you step out for a moment from you have the Ovdei Hashem sort of step out of the ring, and you just say, everyone inside this territory is one or another form of advocate for a kind of worship of a false god. And I don't think that it's sufficient to say, well, they're all not worshiping Hashem, so they all fail and they're all wrong. Because in practice, it's still the case that someone ends up on top, right? Someone ends up perhaps the ruler of that whole territory, or someone, or at least a few different ways of doing things end up being, more successful than others. And I think sometimes that's the case, because you could say they're getting it more correct. Like they have something that's not, there's a spectrum in a sense, and there's some ideological systems that some people could put forward that they're going to fail faster and bigger. Like communism, for example. Like we think of communism as having been a big deal for 100 years, but really in terms of human history, that was the blink of an eye, right? Like the 20th century, I don't know, maybe there's a lot more communism to come, and I'm being too optimistic, but there were very big and heavy efforts to try to create communist societies in the 20th century, and they were massive failures because there was such incoherence to their understanding of almost objective economic laws of how people deal with each other, having to do with human psychology and material wealth and whatever else, and so that they couldn't persist. And there were famines and there were shortages, and it all kind of fizzled. And so that I would point to as sort of saying, like, you can create an ideological system that can get people motivated to try it out, but the world is a rough and competitive place, and there are other systems that are more successful, probably partly because they are maybe they're understanding something more about what's true about the world Hashem has made and how to get along in it, but they don't understand everything, and they still in their own way are flawed and overly simple. And so I'm just saying that if you imagine people at the beginning of human civilizations trying out, trying to sell different forms of worship of images or whatever to each other, that there's kind of a competition amongst them, and they're a Darwinian competition in a sense, you might imagine, that could lead to certain ones being more successful than others. And that doesn't mean that these are Hashem's favorite idolatries and he approved them and put his stamp on them or something. But it does mean perhaps that those that do survive, there's more that's tempting in them, because they are in a sense based on technologies that work in the social world, that they are able to organize people in ways that persist and lead to a certain amount of flourishing. And they may also have fatal flaws, and it may just take a really long time for those to express themselves. Rome was in charge for a long time, but Rome ultimately fell, and there were many other periods in the world where some form of warped ideological system was on top, but then it sort of fell apart according to its own internal contradictions. So I think that's all I was saying, is that you could imagine that even, though in one sense, according to our prophets, all forms of idolatry are wrong, there still could be kind of a Darwinian sense in which some of them are more likely to be successful in the short term or in the midterm.
Thank you very much, Dr. England.
My pleasure as always.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.